The history of Judaism in Europe is both long and complicated, to say the least. For centuries, Jews in Europe, especially in the Russian Empire, were either outright attacked or just kept at arm's length from the rest of the population. The establishment of the Soviet Union, however, based on the principles of Marxism-Leninism, at least on paper, was supposed to do away with the concepts of nationalism and instead focus on unity through class solidarity. Participation in the Bolshevik movement was marked by a high relative percentage of ethnic Jews, although the vast majority had ceased to identify themselves as Jews and were certainly non-practicing. A system of government and society that downplayed nationalism and upheld class solidarity, regardless of birth, clearly held a great deal of appeal for many. The conduct of the Second World War in the USSR, however, changed this and allowed for nationalism to re-emerge, with many of the associated evils that came with it. Today, we are going to explore one of those facets, the Doctor's Plot. Shout out to one of our most cherished partners, Magellan TV, for sponsoring this video. We love these sponsorships from Magellan TV, as this new type of documentary streaming membership has the richest and most varied history content available anywhere. Ancient, modern, current, early modern, war, biography, and even non-historical genres like science and crime are historical in nature. Magellan TV will give you insight and knowledge about the topics you're passionate about. This service, run by filmmakers, has over 2,000 documentaries across many series, and one of the most impressive playlists covers the biographies of historical mass murderers, from Stalin to Papa Doc and Hitler to Mussolini. You can stream Magellan from anywhere on any device without any ads and no limited access. New programs are added on a weekly basis, with many available in 4K. If you haven't tried out Magellan yet, go to try.magellantv.com/thecoldwar or click the link in the description for a free 1-month membership trial. In the wake of the victory over Nazi Germany, the Russian nation was propagated as the big brother in the family of Soviet nations and the leading force in the Soviet state. This direction was launched with a toast by Stalin at a banquet dedicated to the victory in the Great Patriotic War, stating that the Russian nation, quote, is the most outstanding nation among nations in the Soviet Union, end quote. This toast was followed by further instructions for party organizers to promote widely the great traditions of the great Russian nation as the most outstanding nation in the Soviet Union. The history of peoples in Russia is the history of overcoming animosity and uniting around the Russian nation, which carried a mission of liberation and played a leading role in helping other brother nations to stand up shoulder to shoulder with its big brother. At the same time this was happening, a campaign was begun in 1948 against rootless cosmopolitanism and awe in the face of modern bourgeois culture of the West, which was to last until Stalin's death in 1953. The official propaganda of the campaign criticized parts of the Soviet intelligentsia, which was assumed to be sympathetic towards Western art and science, that it had forgotten about class struggle and the aims of Soviet art and science. It is widely understood that this campaign was rooted in anti-Semitic beliefs. The campaign, not coincidentally, was launched in the same time period as the creation of the State of Israel. The Soviet Union was initially a supporter of Israel, hoping it would become a socialist ally in the Middle East. However, Israel's strong pro-Western position, combined with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, links to the West, all contributed to the Soviet campaign against, quote-unquote, rootless cosmopolitanism. But what was the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee? Formed in 1942, it called for all Jewish people around the world to support the Soviet Union. This call was primarily made in the United States, where the Jewish Council for Russian War Relief was headed by Albert Einstein. It played a significant role in lobbying for assistance for the Soviet Union during the war years. With the conclusion of the war, the committee did not stop its work and joined projects with other Jewish organizations documenting the events of the Holocaust. This was against the official Soviet stance, however, as the committee singled out the Jewish community while the Soviet Union took the stance the Nazi atrocities took place against all Soviet citizens, and that it was wrong to point out atrocities against one single group. By 1946, on the recommendation of the MGB, the Ministry for State Security, persecution of the committee had begun for its nationalistic tendencies and the anti-Soviet attitude of some of its members. In 1948, the former chairman, Solomon Mikols, was killed in Minsk on orders from Stalin. The committee was then shut down as it was a center of anti-Soviet propaganda. This was then followed by the arrest of its leaders and prominent members. The majority of those arrested received death sentences. Included in this was the head doctor of Moscow's Botkin Hospital. All of this led to a further organized wave of repression across the Soviet Union, targeting those of Jewish background. This was of course magnified by the early Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Soviet leadership viewed any contact with the West through a lens of suspicion, and the Jewish intelligentsia was specifically targeted as being sympathetic to the West. They were viewed as potential assets for American and British intelligence services through their relationships with international Jewish organizations. So now we have a feel for the atmosphere of anti-Semitism that existed in the Soviet Union in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Now, the doctors' plot. The pretext for the repression of doctors in the Soviet Union was based on a 1948 letter sent by a cardiologist, Dr. Lydia Timoshuk, to the head of Stalin's security, where she complained that the doctor involved in the treatment of Andrei Zhdanov had not only given him the wrong treatment resulting in his death, but then conspired to cover it up. Zhdanov was a member of the Central Committee and was widely believed to be Stalin's successor in waiting. Zhdanov had suffered a heart attack and was being treated by Professor Yakov Eitinger. The letter from Dr. Timoshuk was initially ignored. In fact, it was ignored for 4 years. And then, in August 1952, Dr. Timoshuk was summoned by the MGB and interrogated about the illness and death of Zhdanov. This fit with a previous line of investigation by MGB investigator Mikhail Ryumin, who had led the interrogation, or more accurately torture, of Professor Eitinger, but had been forced to step down on the orders of Minister for State Security Viktor Semyonovich Abakumov. Incidentally, Abakumov was then forced to resign as Ryumin wrote to Stalin personally, accusing Abakumov of not doing enough to stop the doctors from planning to kill the senior Soviet leadership. So, based on the letter from Dr. Timoshuk, as well as the intervention by Ryumin to Stalin, Ryumin was tasked to lead the investigation of the plotting doctors. In October of 1952, Semyon Ignatiev, the new head of the MGB, informed Stalin that a preliminary investigation had concluded there was a plot by several doctors to kill some of the party leadership. Stalin, naturally, immediately sanctioned the arrest of the plotters and assumed personal control of the interrogations. He ordered the investigation to obtain confessions from the accused and to make sure the Zionist nature of the plotters was uncovered, including their links to British and American intelligence organizations, fronted by the Jewish charity organization Joint. In December of 1952, Stalin informed the Politburo of the supposed plot, accusing the Politburo of negligence and failing to see the plot themselves. Quote, "You are like blind kittens. What would happen without me? The country would die because you cannot reveal enemies." Unquote. On the 13th of January, a propaganda campaign was launched in Pravda, the newspaper of the party. The article was titled, "Lowly Spies and Killers Masked as Professor Doctors," a thinly veiled stab at the supposed Zionist nature of the case. It stated that the majority of this terrorist group, Vovsi, Kogan, Feldman, Greenstein, Eitinger, and others, were bought by the American intelligence. They were recruited by the branch of American intelligence, International Jewish Bourgeois, nationalistic organization Joint. The dirty face of this spy Zionist organization, which masks its operation under the guise of charity, has been fully exposed. The article made reference to 9 main plotters, all of whom had been arrested before the article was published. The majority of them were professors and happened to be Jewish. Included in the arrested was not only Miron Vovsi, the head doctor of the Red Army, but also Peter Yegorov, Stalin's personal physician. Later on, in connection with the case, a further 20 doctors and professors were arrested, of whom 12 were Jewish. This group included Boris Zbarsky, who was in charge of Lenin's mausoleum and the continued mummification of Lenin's body. The wheels were set in motion for a series of public trials of the accused. However, this was halted by a key event on March 5, 1953. Stalin died. On the orders of the new Minister of Internal Affairs, Lavrentiy Beria, the criminal proceedings were quickly dropped. However, it is interesting to note that the propaganda campaign did not stop right away. On March 10, an article was published in Pravda regarding broad spy activities being conducted by the United States against the Soviet Union, including doctors who had, quote, sold out to Americans and England. By April 3, 1953, all the people arrested in connection with the doctors' plot were released and even restored to their places of work. On April 4, it was declared that the confessions that had been given were taken through unacceptable means of interrogation, meaning torture. Ryumin himself was arrested on the orders of Beria, and he was later executed. Dr. Timoshuk, who had been awarded the Order of Lenin, quote, for assistance to the government in the case of exposing the murderer doctors, end quote, had the Order of Lenin revoked in disgrace. It's been claimed that the final stage of the doctors' plot backlash would be the wholesale deportation of the Jewish population in the Soviet Union to Siberia and the Far East. This would have begun with the public hangings of the sentenced doctors, then followed by strong anti-Jewish propaganda campaigns, ultimately leading to deportations of the Jews for their own safety, from the inevitable pogroms and riots. This has only ever been a rumor, and no documentation has ever been uncovered to prove this part of the plan, although several senior members of the Soviet government at the time recall the plan being discussed at the highest levels. The death of Stalin marked an end to waves of repression and signaled the start of the upcoming thaw, a milder and less repressive period in Soviet history. The doctors' plot, a fabrication to help inflame anti-Semitic feelings across the Soviet Union, marked the last days of Stalin, and only his death prevented the deaths of those innocent. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.